In this video today, I want to implore you to come up with your own diabolical scheme. I want you to sit down and design through your own machinations and guile and slyness. Channel your inner fox in a way that allows you to design a plan, something where you're constructing towards something using cunning and trickery and maybe more underhanded tactics, the more nefarious, insidious ones, rather than strength and power. Because I think the exercise can be quite useful to someone who's too reliant on one methodology, one formation of success being that I just do, and via might overpowering strength do I conquer and am victorious. But we can see throughout history that this is not always the case, that diplomacy, in that way politicking effectively, can actually lead to better outcomes and more prodigious success than if you just try to smash everything. And this is the case, I think, most evidently with someone like Bismarck, who considered himself a statesman, and this is how we can concur with what we consider a statesman's abilities, whether they're superlative or poor, is that they're able to achieve outcomes through other means in terms of designing and contracting and being nefarious with their dealings. And I think it's not necessarily negative. We don't have to impute certain moral underpinnings on these actions in that way necessarily. Now, will I suggest that you pocket sand someone in the eyes during a duel? No, I think that is probably the immoral case for underhanded tactics. And that's not guileful or clever, it's just disreputable and disdainful. So I think what the idea, at least for this me imploring you exercise, is to say, if you have a strategy to get to an outcome in life, I think there's a lot to be said of employing traditional methods of application of action and force, and you continue to chug and plug away at certain activities till you get your success, if that's business, if that's politics, if that's whatever outcome you're trying to achieve, has a certain road towards it, and that you can just continue down that pathway. But there can be shortcuts, or there can be ways of dealing with the hurdles which don't necessitate you employing the same methodologies over and over again. And so this is where I would implore you once again to consider being deceitful and cunning. Machiavelli has a lot in his treatise on this, around the differentiation between the powers you possess. What is it that you can think about doing that doesn't necessarily equate to a certain fixed idea of actions, but is a plethora or a bevy of certain and you could say significantly differentiated methods of applying actions to goals. And so he equates it to a lion and a fox, and the lion is obviously very straightforward and forthright in how they approach things using their courage and physical might, but the fox is slightly different. And this is where there's the, you could say, double-sided effect here. If someone's trying to be cunning and deceitful and guileful to you, then it's only appreciated by you if you are actually also trying to manipulate them, or at least transact on that level. If you've watched any mixed martial arts, then you'll know that those who focus on, say, like one method, which could be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, submissions, or wrestling, are always counterbalanced by the person who also uses that school, but only maybe defensively. So a boxer or a kickboxer or someone who trained in defensive wrestling has much more capabilities in dealing with a threat because they know what to see and look for. Now, they're not as good at wrestling or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as their opponent, but they don't need to be. I just need to be able to recognize when something's being done to me. And so you can carry that through into your life, as when is it I'm encountering someone who's trying to deceive me, who's trying to defraud me, or is at least being underhanded in how they're dealing with me. And this duplicitousness you can be much better at spotting if you yourself deploy and employ some of these untraditional, you could say heterodox means. Now, the trickery and deceit is based on your own creativity. The smarter you are, I would say, the more depth and sophistication and acumen you can deploy in these realms. And if I sit there and I can design a fairly complex schema, then perhaps that's something that I can bake into how I interact with people and what I want to get out of people. And once again, you're not trying to necessarily manipulate them into immoral activity here. I'm not trying to groom someone or steal someone's money or defraud an old lady. It's much more around there's a goal, and if I can be a bit more guileful in how I consider my approach to the goal, then there's ways of dealing with people's certain behaviors and opinions and perceptions that I can then manipulate in a certain way. And this is where we cross that border between moral and immoral, but like noble and ignoble, things like this. This is probably a lot to do with the Loki and that trickster mentality. It's imbued in the Faustian man in that way that we see it as the borderline between, I would say, shameful behavior, but something that's very, very negatively disposed towards. And rather, if it's something impressively pulled off, and that could go for Bismarckian statesmanship, it's that he dealt with many people underhandedly and lied and was able to prosper throughout his entire political career by not revealing cards and playing people against each other in that Machiavellian way. And we consider him a great man for that reason, is that he was able to employ these tricks or this deceitfulness. But the idea, I think, is that you just have to generate first your goals and what you want and you consider to be worth doing and worthwhile approaching and trying to win. Even Nixon had this when he had something called the madman theory, and how you approach this is particularly evident in politics, but it can be the same for business. How you approach a goal is much more around perception of the other. So making sure that they understand certain things that you want them to understand, and whether they're true or not is actually irrelevant to their understanding. They need to just agree, or they need to have this perception and this acquiescence to it. I'll quickly read just a little excerpt here from Spengler on cunningness. All we know is that so far there is neither a real nation nor a real state. Can both of these develop out of knocks of fate, or is this possibility excluded by the very fact of the colonial type, whose spiritual past belongs elsewhere and is now dead? The American does not talk of state or mother country like the Englishman, but of this country. Actually, what it amounts to is a boundless field and a population of trappers drifting from town to town in the dollar hunt, unscrupulous and dissolute. For the law is only for those who are not cunning or powerful enough to ignore it. And it is most evident, I think, other than in Third Worlders, which is much more around corruption and lying in a way to, you could say, gain or dispossess your neighbor and humiliate them and disenfranchise them, rather than it is in America, where I think there's the approach that if I can win, then I'll take whatever means available to me to do that, regardless of, as I say before, the moral implications, and whether you're trying to apply certain rectitude or there's a moral quandary or not is more around your perception of the necessity to have that conversation, that internal monologue or dialogue around, do I feel as if this is actually something that's worth an ethical consideration, a pondering on. And in our appreciation, I think, of Americans, I think that you can see that there is a kind of disposition toward both the application of basic cunning, basic low cunning, deception, and not that I think the sophistication marker, albeit is from a poetic or artistic standpoint fairly admirable. Say someone like Bismarck was so adroit at it that it becomes artful. It's much more around that the American will employ those tools to hand in a way that's effective, or is most effective. And in general, the American considers money to be the predominating force of its life. Spiritual pull, that will to infinite power is much more like a will to infinite money and booty. But in general, I think we can still appreciate that there's the unscrupulousness of the American towards a goal, whereas you're much more lacking particularly in European countries around that. There's more waiting on the moral factor. I'd rather feel good than win. And this is how you can see that and sense that decline, is that once you start caring about other people's feelings or empathetic or perceptions, then what you're really doing is handicapping yourself for no apparent reason. They may not, particularly if it's an alien or the other, consider that you at all as to be a fair game or want it to be played in certain realms of gentlemanly agreement. And you can see this with sports. The English Anglo particularly has an idea of a gentlemanly conduct around certain sporting endeavours that just isn't felt by third worlders that also participate in those realms. They're just going by the motions as needed, and if they're able to get away with certain things, then they will. You look at soccer, and there's a massive degenerating force around the conduct of soccer players in general since the the 20th century. But it also goes into other realms, particularly, as I say, sports, but law and business. Now, I'll leave off with just a reckoning here around how the Vikings considered raiding parties not just to be about violence or like plunder, although it was obviously somewhat about that. But there was a reputation, you could say, accustomed to building a reputation from activities around what was a vocation. And so if you can be skillful or you can be brave, then these are obviously very important things, but they still had an appreciation for this idea of being cunning, this idea of trickery, of deceit, of being able to, and you may see it popularized in the Vikings TV show here, but when you go into Paris pretending to be dead and jump out of a coffin and still be able to take the city by force. I think that sort of admiration is an inherent quality in us. We understand that the Trojan horse, while seemingly negative for the Trojans, was actually a superlative coup de grace for the Greeks in that. And so what we understand now is that the perception of skill is much more around our disposition toward the friend and enemy, and we consider our friends doing deceitful things that end up having them win as something of a lark, or it's actually admirable quality, and obviously being defrauded by a Nigerian trying to steal your social security number is something that we don't admire, and that's an admonishment of their low moral character. So I think the summary here is to say, build your own diabolical plan. Think and try to generate all ideas around how to achieve goals in any which way, and leave morality aside, just at least in the ideative phase, and you come up with and see if you can galvanize yourself into a certain mode of operating that maybe clashes with your instinctual ethical calculator, but then once you've overcome that, you've de-ridden yourself of these spooks, then maybe you actually come to an agreement around, yes, I can morally be okay with winning in any way possible.